When she was just 14, a girl named Zoya suddenly discovered a strange ability. Whenever she read a newspaper article about a murder, she could clearly visualize how the killer committed the crime. Even more bizarre, she could seemingly conjure up the scene where the victim's body was discarded out of thin air. And through conversations with classmates, she even had a premonition that one of her female classmates would be murdered. Despite her young age, Zoya displayed a maturity that was strikingly different from her peers. So, when she grew up, she became a profiler specializing in crime analysis. Whenever the police encountered a tricky case, they would often need her assistance to clarify the clues. This time, she had just completed an analytical task and had narrowed down a pool of 217 suspects to just 13. Given Zoya's outstanding performance, her director gave her an even more challenging serial killer case. The murderer was extremely twisted, turning the victims' bodies into artistic sculptures and displaying them in tourist areas. Zoya's interest was immediately piqued, and she found a thrill in playing a game of wits with the killer. She was fascinated by the killer's perverse methods, constantly constructing an image of the murderer in her mind. Even in the elevator on her way home, every stranger looked like a deranged killer to her, especially the man across from her, who was staring. The atmosphere was incredibly tense, so she instinctively pulled out her pepper spray, as if the killer might reveal a twisted face at any moment. Luckily, at the last second, the elevator doors suddenly opened. Later, while having dinner with her roommate, she became increasingly excited talking about the murder case. But the next second, she suddenly zoned out, fantasizing that she had become the killer's next target. These strange occurrences kept happening. Her roommate told her that someone had sent her something, but it had been mistakenly mailed to her old address. She opened it to find an old men's tie. She sniffed it sensitively. Clearly, she was no stranger to such oddities, as her drawer was already full of envelopes she had previously received. The next day, while on her morning run, she suddenly felt endangered again. Why was she being followed by a person in black? Anxious, she kept looking back while speeding up. Then she picked up a rock from the roadside and stopped, ready to throw it if the person in black got too close. But to her surprise, the person just ran past her. However, that night, the more she thought about it, the more something felt off. Childhood memories flooded back, one after another. She had a sinister premonition. How could all of this be connected to her own experiences? So, she dug out the tie from her drawer and eerily wrapped it around her neck. With a strong pull, she seemed to see the killer with surprise in a near-death experience. Just then, she suddenly received a call from an unknown number. The caller didn't say anything, only eerie breathing sounds came through the phone. Her premonition might have come true once again, because all of this seemed to stem from the extremely twisted murder case she was investigating. In a dimly lit room, a girl sat naked at a dining table. A man in a hoodie poured her a glass of red wine, then brought food to her mouth. At this moment, fear consumed the girl's heart. She was too terrified to move, her hands and feet tightly bound with rope. Unexpectedly, the man then left the room, seemingly to prepare some kind of potion. Seeing an opportunity, the girl immediately used a candle to burn through the ropes on her hands. But in her nervousness, the sound of her falling to the floor was heard by the man. As she tried to cut the ropes on her feet, the man suddenly wrapped a scarf around her neck from behind. A young girl lost her precious life. The next day, the police quickly found the girl's body by the river. And this was just the beginning. Under the beautiful and bustling nightscape of St. Petersburg, the killer adjusted his fake nose, then got out of his car and approached a girl soliciting business by the roadside. Another young girl was murdered by the killer to the sound of music. However, after embalming the body, the man transformed the girl into a doll, capable of being posed in any strange or bizarre way. The next step, the killer then put the girl in his car. The man carried the girl to the beach. Unfortunately, he encountered a couple strolling there. Fearing discovery, he immediately pulled out a fruit knife. Unexpectedly, the couple walked right past him without even a glance. Sure enough, the killer's twisted masterpiece now became his exhibited artwork. It was precisely because of such a challenging case that the police department enlisted Zoya, the profiler obsessed with crime analysis, and also brought in Murphy from the Special Operations Unit to assist. However, the director's true intention was for Murphy to act as his eyes and ears, reporting progress at all times. That night, Murphy began to learn about Zoya online. His grandfather reminded him that she seemed like an interesting woman. He then arrived in St. Petersburg to report for duty and immediately attended a police team meeting. The first victim was an art student. Due to the embalming, the exact time of death couldn't be determined. The body's skin was entirely orange, but only her left foot had visibly turned black. Forensic analysis estimated she had been dead for over 5 days, and the cause of death was asphyxiation from strangulation. Traces of embalming the body were found in the bathtub of her apartment. The second victim was even more bizarrely strange. Someone found her tied upright to a bridge. The cause of death was identical to the first victim, though traces of body paint were found on one of her legs. Based on skin color, the forensic team determined that the killer used different embalming fluids in the 2 cases and left no DNA traces on the bodies. To make matters worse, there were no eyewitnesses at the scene, and the surveillance footage was inexplicably broken. Fortunately, the police hired a doctor of criminal psychology, which helped narrow down the suspect pool. However, when Murphy met this so-called doctor, he found him to be merely an armchair theorist, good at talking the talk but little else. Such a person might be fine for dealing with the media. But for Murphy to genuinely solve the case, the doctor's theories were utterly useless. Whenever she thought of the killer's actions, she could immerse herself in the crime scene, as if she had become the victim, being strangled from behind and unable to breathe. Even more strangely, she could somehow recreate the scene where the victim's body was dumped out of thin air. This was 14-year-old Zoya. So, she went to the small river alone, once again verifying her peculiar ability. Just as she was about to leave, satisfied, she actually saw a dark figure hidden behind a large tree. She initially thought it was just a subconscious hallucination, but then a familiar voice suddenly spoke. It turned out to be Ruslan, a friend from the auto repair shop. Zoya's tense mood finally calmed down a bit. However, her subsequent question received an incredibly strange answer from him. Perhaps she was being overly suspicious. Could Ruslan be the killer who returned to admire his masterpiece? This doubt bothered her into the night. Yet she still couldn't figure it out. She seemed to enter the crime scene again. This time, however, she found herself walking alone on an empty street. But at some point, a person in black started following her from behind. She quickly picked up her pace, but the other person also started running right behind her. It was all a dream. Zoya, obsessed with solving cases, was currently on a plane to St. Petersburg. She finally met Murphy, her partner for the serial murder case. No sooner had they started discussing the case than Murphy began complaining incessantly about the BS experts there. Zoya had only known about this person's reputation from television, but it wasn't until the police squad meeting that she truly experienced the experts' nonsensical abilities. When she heard the expert suggest the killer likely worked in a funeral home, Zoya's temper flared. She flat out retorted, "Then how do you explain the decayed foot? The killer is clearly an amateur at embalming, and he's experimenting on each victim." Zoya then contradicted Murphy's suggestion, arguing that the killer wouldn't return to the scene to revel in the murder, as the crime scene had no direct connection to the killer's fantasies, and strict policing was a waste of police resources. Just then, the team received a call reporting the discovery of a third body. Zoya quickly followed Murphy to the scene, and the girl, posed as the thinker, immediately came into view. The forensic team at the scene made a preliminary assessment. The victim, like the others, had been strangled, as a deep blood mark was visible on her neck. But Zoya noticed that the victim had a ring on her hand, while the previous two victims had no jewelry found on them. She then inferred, based on the sun exposure marks on the skin, that the victim was likely a prostitute. Zoya also visited a famous funeral home in St. Petersburg. With her charming smile and flattery, she finally gained the funeral home owner's help, and many of her lingering questions were answered. The decay in the victim's leg was because the killer's technique was still inadequate. He either lacked the patience to massage the body's blood vessels, or he operated improperly, accidentally spilling embalming fluid onto the left leg when mixing it. Furthermore, the killer had a complete failure. For aesthetic reasons, embalmers must sew the victim's mouth shut, but this body's mouth remained open. Soon after, through the embalmer's patient explanation, Zoya gained some insight into the killer's criminal psychology. Back at the police station, she learned that the captain had quickly found the victim's roommate by following her lead. The three of them promptly began their investigation, and finally discovered that the third victim didn't use drugs, was friendly, and got along well with almost everyone she knew. However, the victim had never worn a ring, nor did she own a yellow shirt or a brown polka dot skirt. Additionally, the roommate remembered a guy covered in tattoos, whose car no one dared to get into. The case finally made a little progress. Zoya also organized her thoughts late at night, feeling as if she had re-entered the killer's world. This person must have carefully disguised himself from head to toe before seeking out victims, and the beautiful girls the killer had murdered had accumulated into countless numbers over the years. Just then, Zoya's phone suddenly received a message. She opened the screen to see it was from the crime expert she had angered earlier. He had also sent an urgently produced video which contained the entire meeting, concluding with a voiceover narration with his face swapped. Because girls in the small town were constantly being strangely murdered, Zoya often imagined herself as a victim to understand the killer's methods and criminal psychology. Even more incredibly, she had a premonition of a classmate's death. Later, at the classmate's funeral, she was actually able to pinpoint a suspect. To confirm her judgment, she rushed to her classmate's house to research online. She discovered that the characteristics of a schizophrenic killer were strikingly similar to a boy she liked. This person was Ruslan from the auto repair shop. Ruslan always thoughtfully asked how she was doing, constantly asked her parents for food, and even left his house keys at her place. Even more suspicious, Ruslan had also gone to the murder scene, and often these twisted serial killers returned to the crime scene to fantasize about their murders. The more Zoya thought about it then, the more certain she became. However, her mother didn't want to hear her frightening thoughts, and given the recent serial murders, she believed it was safest for Zoya to stay at home. But as soon as her mother left, Zoya grabbed Ruslan's keys that he had left at her house. Seeing no one around, she secretly opened Ruslan's front door. Because instead of relying solely on subjective intuition, it was better to directly search for evidence at the suspect's home. Driven by this strong curiosity, she had to verify her intuition. However, there seemed to be nothing suspicious here. She only found 2 human sketches in a drawer. But when she looked under the bed, she made a new discovery. Why were there women's clothes on the floor? Pulling out a shoebox from under the bed, she found some gold and silver jewelry inside. Even more suspiciously, the box also contained a blood-stained piece of women's underwear. Just then, the sound of a door opening suddenly came from downstairs. Zoya quickly put everything back in its place, then tiptoed downstairs. It turned out Ruslan had come home early for some reason. Zoya panicked. She tried to sneak out while he was changing clothes, but she was almost discovered. It seemed the front door downstairs was not an option, so she slipped into the bedroom and ran onto the balcony to hide. But once there, she noticed something else. Why had Ruslan come to the backyard with coffee? Fortunately, he didn't look up, allowing her to carefully walk across the roof and then safely jump to the ground along the eaves. She thought she had escaped unnoticed, but to her surprise, just as she reached the door, she was discovered by Ruslan, who happened to be stepping out. Zoya was flustered and at a loss, fabricating an excuse that even she didn't believe. Luckily, an elderly neighbor passed by, finally breaking the awkward silence. Zoya quickly took a couple of steps, following the neighbor without looking back. From then on, such past events frequently resurfaced in Zoya's mind. And now, the twisted serial killer she encountered seemed to have an eerie, deja vu-like coincidence with the unsolved serial murder case from her childhood. This time, however, female bodies were found consecutively in different parts of the city, all having undergone almost professional embalming. Even more bizarre, the victims were dressed and posed in a way that represented some kind of power fantasy. So, what was the killer's psychological motive? This perplexing problem continued to trouble the 3 investigators who had yet to find a lead. Unexpectedly, they had a breakthrough the next day. Over the past 2.5 years, there had been 27 cases of embalmed animals. Even more coincidentally, all the deceased animals were also posed in unnatural positions. Could the killer have initially experimented with embalming animals? Because the police would not pay attention to hunters. Although this was just a guess, for Zoya, it was good news for solving the case. Later, during dinner, she couldn't help but start fantasizing and deducing the murderer. This time, strangely, she imagined herself lying in bed with Murphy. After a series of deductions, based on the time intervals between victims' deaths, she concluded that the killer was likely to strike again within 3 days. At this point, Zoya suddenly realized that the next victim would likely still be a prostitute. However, only the first victim was an art student, so it was time to talk to her classmates. Zoya and Murphy then went to the victim's best friend's house, and they actually found something there. The victim had a former boyfriend, and this ex-boyfriend was actually the best friend's current boyfriend, and the victim was preparing to move apartments before her death because the landlord was a despicable jerk. These numerous clues were perplexing, and Zoya began to fantasize about the suspicious relationship between the victim and this couple. That night, she filtered out the killer's potential next target from thousands of high-risk individuals working as prostitutes, then instructed her assistant to call them one by one according to the list. And just as Zoya had predicted, under the captivating night sky of St. Petersburg, a young, beautiful girl was targeted by a man in a car. She perfectly fit the age demographic of 19 to 25, was completely smooth without a single tattoo or piercing, and was soliciting business alone. She was clearly the serial killer's ideal target. The girl carelessly got into the stranger's car, but she could never have imagined that this would be her last day alive. Soon, as the car drove further and further away, she couldn't help but start to worry and fear. But when she heard there would be more tips, she was still tempted. However, in the moments that followed, she had already been regarded by the killer as another embalming project, about to become a human specimen, just like a doll. But this time, it was even more sudden. The killer, without a word, eagerly brandished his weapon, then handcuffed her, shackled her with chains, and even put a gag on her mouth. But just as the killer was about to prepare the embalming fluid, he discovered he had run out of materials. So, he had no choice but to take off his protective suit and then hurriedly drive out. Unexpectedly, just then, the kidnapped girl's phone in her bag suddenly rang. Luckily, the call was from the police's systematic sweep. However, at this moment, she couldn't speak, only make humming sounds into the phone. So Murphy began to spell out all the letters in order. As soon as the word for the abduction location was spelled out, the police would rush to the scene for rescue. With this method, they quickly spelled out the first 3 letters, which simultaneously narrowed down the street search list. But just as they were about to further check the address, the killer suddenly returned. Although the phone was still ringing, only the bound girl's utterly desperate screams remained. She was a twisted profiler who could perceive serial killers. She not only possessed the strange ability of hypothetical deduction, but could also find clues by investigating the killer's quirks. At this moment, she had never been so close to the serial killer. She slowly approached the van, then suddenly stopped. The killer inside the car was already starting to lose his composure. This was a psychological game of wits between Zoya and the serial killer, because the police were just one step away from pinpointing the exact location of the kidnapped girl, but unfortunately, they were a step too late. Although the girl tragically lost her life, it created immense psychological pressure on the killer. Due to insufficient time for embalming, he was growing frantic. Coupled with the possibility that the embalming room's address might have been exposed, he had no choice but to transfer the body to the car. Who would have thought the police had quickly sealed off the relevant road sections? As a result, they narrowly missed each other again. During the subsequent search, the police actually failed to find the girl's body in his car. The killer calmly drove away. But where did the murdered girl go? Soon, it was early morning the next day, and the police finally found the murdered girl under the bridge. And looking at the tragic scene where the body was dumped, Zoya began to have involuntary hallucinations again. She saw a car stop in front of her. On closer inspection, it was him, Ruslan, the killer she had suspected since childhood. Even more strangely, Ruslan actually walked towards Zoya. At this moment, Zoya appeared calm on the surface, but inwardly, she was gripped by extreme fear. It turned out the person knocking on the car window was her partner, Murphy. Zoya then quietly sat beside the deceased. It was now certain that the victim was killed by that psychopath, and he was already searching for his next victim. Zoya felt that ominous premonition from her childhood again. She had a premonition of her female classmate's murder and was convinced Ruslan was the killer. But when she told the police chief everything she had deduced, the chief told her it couldn't be Ruslan. It turned out that Ruslan had an alibi at the time her female classmate was murdered, and as many as 78 people could testify for him. Even the chief himself was with him in the search party for the missing classmate. Zoya was speechless, but she still believed in her strange intuition. To appease her mother, who was constantly worried, her father actually brought up the real culprit the police had basically confirmed, Semyon Rogov. At this moment, Zoya was confused. How could it be that timid male classmate? Did he become a killer because he was bullied? And why would he harm unrelated female classmates? But the chief explained to her father, the killer followed the female classmate every day like a shadow. And what was most egregious was that when the girl was found, she was not only completely naked, but she also had a dark gray tie tied around her neck. From then on, her father no longer believed Zoya's strange ideas and told her to stay quietly at home. The town's adults had organized a full meeting to catch the killer. But that very night, when only Zoya and her sister were home alone, the sound of a door opening suddenly came. The sisters thought their mother had returned. But when Zoya walked out of the bedroom, she saw Ruslan sneaking in. In an instant, the entire room was filled with terrifying fear. She hurriedly locked the door, then impulsively pushed a table against it. Worried this wasn't enough, she quickly knocked over a bookshelf to brace the table. At this moment, Zoya was extremely agitated. But Ruslan outside the door just wanted to talk kindly, and even though he patiently explained himself, she refused to open the door. So, with no other choice, Ruslan quietly left. The sisters were still shaken, but Zoya heard that the sounds outside had stopped, and just as she was about to open the door to check, she was suddenly hit with brute force and knocked under the table. Through the door crack, a terrifying black hand reached in. Ruslan hadn't left at all. At this point, he revealed his sinister face and began to perversely describe the details of his crimes to provoke Zoya. Zoya, seeing this, immediately opened the window and shouted for help to the neighbors. But all the adults in town had gone to catch the killer. Fortunately, the elderly woman finally heard her and promptly called the police. Ruslan, feeling that he couldn't succeed, quickly slipped away. The sisters finally breathed a sigh of relief. Before long, the town returned to its usual calm. It turned out that Ruslan mysteriously disappeared that night, and he had meticulously cleaned all traces from his home. No one believed he was a twisted serial killer. It was even rumored that Zoya's madness had scared him away, and the police arrested the poor male classmate, haphazardly closing the case in confusion. But a doubt lingered in Zoya's mind. How did Ruslan fabricate his alibi? From then on, Zoya began receiving mailed envelopes, and when she opened them, inside was always that dark gray tie used for the murders. By now, her drawer was full of these ties, seemingly revealing a pattern. Could each tie used for murder represent the life of a young girl? Meanwhile, at the bridge where the deceased girls were commemorated, a journalist also happened to find a strange envelope. He then approached Zoya as a fan and presented the envelope to her. He wanted to exchange it for the latest news on the serial killer, coupled with the viral video of the fake expert's prank. If his small request wasn't met, he could easily defame Zoya's reputation with negative reports. When Zoya opened the envelope the journalist gave her, she already guessed it was a tie, signifying the killer's successful murder. Later, during the police investigation meeting, everyone complained incessantly that sifting through the evidence was like searching for a needle in a haystack. At this point, their only hope was Zoya's analysis of the killer, but it was still just a vague personality profile. Therefore, the police chief began to express dissatisfaction with Zoya's progress, so he hastily assigned tasks and ended the meeting. However, on the way back to the hotel with Murphy, Zoya finally spoke about a past event she couldn't mention at the meeting due to uncertainty. This current psychopath and the killer from the town many years ago might be the same person. He also left bodies by public waterways, but after the police arrested that male classmate, he inexplicably hanged himself in the detention center. From then on, the killings stopped. But Murphy didn't see any connection between the two cases. In reality, both of them had feelings for each other, but this vexing serial murder case completely dampened their spirits. Murphy actually knocked on her door, bringing dinner and beer to apologize for his earlier bluntness. When she learned that Murphy's grandfather had been out of contact for several days, she urged him to go back and check, believing the killer might have already gone into hiding. At the same time, the captain benched both of them. At this moment, looking at the charming Murphy, Zoya again couldn't help but fantasize, though it was merely a beautiful fantasy. The next day, she tried to pull up all murder records from the previous 3 years, and indeed, found a 21-year-old victim whose cause of death was also strangulation, and the perpetrator had not yet been found. She then found that the body had been dismembered, and no DNA samples were left at the crime scene. If she assumed the killer was the same person in this case, then he must have thought of embalming techniques only after this incident. At this point, Zoya already had a plan forming in her mind. So, in Murphy's absence, she began her own investigation. She first found the fiancé of the 21-year-old female victim, questioned him at length, and left behind a photo of Ruslan. Then she found the best friend of the first victim in the current case, but the girl was drowning her sorrows with alcohol because her boyfriend hadn't come home all night. Helpless, after leaving a photo, Zoya went to meet the journalist who had blackmailed her. Finally, she took a taxi to the spot where her female classmate's body had been dumped years ago. She actually saw Ruslan and her classmate happily cycling together. Then, arriving at the beach, she again sensed the two of them passionately embracing, oblivious to their surroundings. However, in the next second, Ruslan pulled out that dark gray tie and proceeded to murder the terrified classmate. Unexpectedly, as Zoya turned her head, she actually saw Ruslan standing right in front of her. She immediately realized this wasn't a hallucination. After all these years, Ruslan had finally come. Zoya, seeing him, ran for her life. The deranged Ruslan forced Zoya to the original murder spot and ordered her to kneel. At this moment, if nothing went wrong, her life would end there. Profiler Zoya fought desperately with the killer from 20 years ago, finally escaping death and being sent to the hospital. But at this moment, her brain was working rapidly, still replaying the entire sequence of events. In the hospital corridor, investigator Murphy, who had just been on a one-day leave and found himself in trouble, also rushed back and waited outside the door. Fortunately, Zoya's physical condition wasn't too serious, which somewhat eased his tense nerves. But as soon as he sat down, he fell into a flashback. 3 years ago, during a mission to apprehend a suspect, he shot and killed him in a moment of desperation. Later, it turned out they had arrested the wrong person, which was the fundamental reason he was transferred from the front lines to an investigator position. Just then, the head of the St. Petersburg homicide unit walked over. And only then did Murphy learn about Zoya's attack. The captain was stunned when he heard this. How did another serial killer suddenly appear? Therefore, after this incident, the St. Petersburg police no longer wished to continue cooperating with the two of them. Coupled with the media's special attention to Zoya, the director placed Murphy on mandatory leave. However, what seemed like a chaotic serial murder case made significant progress during their leave. Zoya, now discharged from the hospital, received comfort and care from her friends. Meanwhile, Murphy became interested in the case analysis she had written at age 14. This is when the envelopes containing the ties finally came to light. There were a total of 11 envelopes here, though Ruslan had originally mailed 14 ties in total. Zoya had given the first one to the town's police chief back then, but received no response. When she collaborated with the police's SK personnel, she gave another one to a senior investigator, but that person instead told her to deal with her personal psychological fears, so she angrily burned the third one. But the ties kept coming after that, so she began collecting all of them and paid out of pocket for DNA and fingerprint analysis, yet still found no clues. What truly terrified her was that some of the envelopes also contained sketches depicting her being assaulted. The reason no one believed Zoya's identification of the killer was because Ruslan conveniently had an alibi. Even the police chief was with him in the same search and rescue team, and her own father could even testify for him. She suspected either there were two killers, or Ruslan had secretly slipped away during the search, committed the murder, and then nonchalantly returned. How did this connect to the current embalmed female body case in St. Petersburg? Murphy then offered his opinion, suggesting that Ruslan must have seen the viral video of Zoya being pranked online, which reawakened his long-suppressed perverse interest. As for the killer who embalmed the bodies, that had to be someone else, right? Perhaps this time, Zoya's intuition was simply wrong. Murphy grabbed the case files and walked out the door. He then drove to the small town where Zoya had lived. After speaking with the local police chief, he learned more details about the case. It turned out that, according to the forensic examination, the female classmate's time of death was between 6 p.m. and 7 p.m. However, the suspect had been at the library until 4 p.m., but the female classmate's disappearance was clearly at 2 p.m. But the chief believed that the girl was probably on a date with her boyfriend at the time, and when she was heading home, she was tricked by the suspect into a secluded spot, where she was then assaulted and killed. Murphy was even more puzzled. Why was this boyfriend not mentioned in the case file? He then found a clue in the date of the forensic examination. Since the body was discovered on the same day, why was the signing date 2 days after the victim's death? What secret was hidden here? However, the chief at the time was only focused on apprehending the killer and knew nothing about the forensic examination process. Murphy urgently contacted the forensic pathologist from that year. He asked why the initial time of death was determined to be 2 p.m., but then changed to between 6 p.m. and 7 p.m., a time when the suspect was conveniently at the library. Subsequently, the timid male classmate, unjustly imprisoned, tragically committed suicide by hanging. His parents were desperate to prove their son's innocence, which was why the forensic pathologist altered the time. Murphy finally confirmed Zoya's deduction from back then, so the next day, he brought a large bag of treats to Zoya's house. It turned out that the police had initially wanted to pin the murder on the male classmate, so they persuaded the forensic pathologist to change the time of death. It seemed this time Zoya might have made a small mistake. The two of them tore down all the distracting clues that covered the bedroom walls and then headed straight for St. Petersburg. But this serial killer who turned girls into dolls, was he doing it just for fun? And why did he eventually abandon them? One girl was dressed in a date dress. Another wore a bride's ring on her hand. The entire embalming process was filled with dirty blood, then the bodies were thoroughly cleaned, and finally dressed in very clean clothes. But why did these clothes fit so strangely well? It wasn't because the victims were all thin. It must be because the killer took the victims to the mall with him. They were getting closer to the truth. At this moment, just as Zoya had surmised, the killer had already started looking for his next beautiful prey. But he had grown tired of frivolous young girls and instead set his sights on a single mother raising her child alone. Clearly, the killer also longed for marriage and children. He watched the warm family inside the house already fantasizing about 3 dolls having dinner with him. But his perversion didn't stop there. He also wanted to quietly place the child in bed, and under the watchful eye of the mother, tell bedtime stories to the 2 children, just like a father. Given this, Zoya didn't have much time left to solve the case. So the 2 of them questioned all the malls with late operating hours, but still found nothing. Zoya suddenly noticed that the clothes displayed on a mannequin were exactly the same as those worn by one of the victims. Prompted by Zoya, the shop owner finally remembered that someone always stared blankly at the mannequin. Upon further review of the surveillance footage, the killer finally revealed his true identity. Unfortunately, the camera didn't capture his face at all. Luckily, after continued tracking, they finally saw the killer's car. Through his colleague's image analysis, Murphy finally traced the car owner's address. It was a dilapidated wooden house, but the owner didn't seem to be home. The neighbor then mentioned that the homeowner had passed away 2 months ago. She wasn't a normal person, constantly drinking, smoking, and cursing her ex-husband, which tragically led to her 13-year-old daughter dying of lung cancer. Even more unexpectedly back then, she used to say her daughter had just fallen asleep from illness and told her 2 sons not to forget to feed her. Now, one of her sons hated his mother so much he changed his surname, and the other seemed to have started a plumbing business. But unfortunately, the elderly neighbor couldn't remember the names of either son. The mention of that name immediately brought someone to Zoya's mind: the fiancé of the 21-year-old female victim from 3 years ago. Zoya concluded that the mother's death was the trigger for the killer's actions. Furthermore, the suspect seen in the surveillance footage perfectly matched Zoya's profiling characteristics. However, one detail didn't align. After the fiancé moved some relatively light cargo, he immediately complained of a backache. So how could he have easily moved a body? Besides, he was already engaged to the deceased. This left only one possibility: the fiancé's brother. They then sought out the fiancé again. When he heard that his own brother was the killer of his fiancée, the man finally broke down. He was completely distraught because Zoya had already guessed that his brother had been intimate with his fiancée, and the brother happened to have keys to his home. Simultaneously, Murphy interjected, suggesting that the victims likely came from a factory's client list. Unexpectedly, this hypothesis was quickly confirmed, and the brother happened to be out visiting clients at that very moment. So the 3 urgently searched the list, and a single mother's name appeared before them. They were right. The serial killer had already knocked on the client's door. As the woman unsuspectingly signed, he leaned in menacingly from behind and suddenly choked her. By the time Zoya and Murphy arrived, it was already evening. Murphy told Zoya to guard the door and wait for police backup, while he quietly climbed the wall alone. He then saw the 2 bound children, and continuing his search inside, he indeed found the serial killer holding a hostage. The serial killer was finally captured by Murphy, and the hostages were safely rescued.